Hi, everybody. My name is Holly. I'm from the Skagit Watershed Council, and today we're going to talk about southern resident orca whales. An outline of the presentation is on your screen, so let's begin with our introduction. Orca whales, or killer whales, can be described through biological classification in the way presented on the screen. They are animals that have bones that are arranged in a particular way. They produce milk for their offspring, and they are the largest member of the dolphin family, which are toothed whales. They are the only currently existing member of their genus. This is the size of an adult relative to adult male human. Now, there are many subspecies of orca whales, and we're lucky enough to have several that live in or around the Salish Sea. Each of these subspecies has their own adaptations that allow them to live their lives a little bit differently. Some of these adaptations are behavioral, such as the way they hunt or interact with other members of their family, and others of them are physical adaptations, such as the structures of their teeth. Here are some teeth of 3 different subspecies that live near us. As you can see, the southern resident has much more narrow and curved teeth relative to the transient. The transient's tooth is a lot bigger, which is great for chomping bones of mammals. However, the southern resident eats animals with much smaller bones, and for them, it's more important to have teeth that are great for chomping down on these large fish that might be trying to swim away. Southern resident orcas, as well as all orcas, are apex predators. This means they're at the top of the food chain. They hunt the hunters in the system, and nothing hunts them. The southern resident orcas are divided into 3 pods. These are family units that are led by a dominant female. These pods often hunt together and can travel long distances in search of their favorite food. In fact, they can go up to 100 miles a day in search of tasty salmon. They have similar life histories to humans. As infants, they're incredibly dependent on their mother that feeds them. But as they get older, they slowly get more independent. And by the time they're in their early teens, they really want to show their independence and keep a good distance from their mothers. This is also about the time they become reproductively capable. And they maintain this ability for the next 30 years or so. After which, they still may have a long life ahead of them. In fact, they may live 50 years after the point in which they're not able to reproduce anymore. And also, they are endangered species. There are only 74 individuals currently living. Let's talk a little bit about their range. They spend their entire life on the Pacific coastline between British Columbia and the western United States. But within that range, they go quite a ways. This red line represents all the places you could potentially see a southern resident orca throughout the year. However, their critical habitat is confined to the Salish Sea. This map shows the portions of the Salish Sea that are considered critical habitat for the southern resident orcas. These critical areas are protected under the Endangered Species Act and the Species at Risk Act for southern residents. I want to point out the Skagit Bay here. This is an important area because it connects to the Skagit River, and we'll talk a little bit more about why that's so important later in the presentation. The population size of the southern resident orcas has been in decline over recent decades, particularly in this period from 1995 to 2002. You can see there was a 20% decrease in their population size. This was a major red flag and ultimately led to them being listed as endangered species and getting protections. So what are the major threats that these whales face? Why are they in decline? We'll discuss those briefly next, starting with their food. Scientists study orca diets by looking at their feces or their poop. They've developed some really interesting tools that enable them to do this, including Tucker, the conservation canine. This is an animal that's been specifically trained to hunt out and find orca whale poop. It's rather important that people are able to find and collect orca whale poop quickly, because the longer it's in the water, the more chance it has to break up and dissolve into the water. Analysis of the poop of the southern resident orcas has shown that they're eating almost entirely salmon. And the great majority of the salmon they're eating is Chinook. There's a problem in that, and that is the Chinook are also endangered species. There are a lot of people who believe we need to focus our efforts of recovering the southern orca whales on the Chinook salmon, because if we don't protect the Chinook salmon, they will both go into extinction together. The National Oceanic and Atmospheric Administration is the organization that is responsible for overseeing marine endangered species in the United States. They've put together this priority list for populations of Chinook salmon to protect, and those that come from the northern Puget Sound area are number 1 and number 5 on the list. This should be especially noteworthy for those of us in the Skagit watershed, because about 50% of the wild Chinook salmon that enter the Puget Sound every year come from the Skagit River. Before I discuss projects to restore the Chinook salmon, first I'd like to review their life cycle. In the Skagit River, we have wild populations of all 5 Pacific salmon species, and they all go through a very similar life cycle in the Skagit watershed, but the details that I'm giving here are specific to the Chinook salmon. They start their lives in the river, and they will stay in the river for the first 1 to 1.5 years of their life. As a general rule, the longer they stay in the river, the more likely they are to live once they make it to the estuary. They start their lives upriver, where their mother has created a redd for them. That's R-E-D-D. That's what you call a salmon nest. She builds the nest by pushing the gravel, which is a particular size, off to the side and deposits her eggs, and then covers them back up with a blanket of gravel. The redd protects them from predators, also from being washed downstream, but allows water to flow through them so that they have plenty of oxygen. This is the male. He is depositing his milt, which includes his sperm, and that is how the eggs are fertilized. Before she deposits her eggs, the inside of the female's body is absolutely stuffed with eggs. This is an image of the body cavity of an adult salmon female, and this is an individual egg here. Now, a strong, healthy Chinook salmon can lay over 4,000 individual eggs. Of those 4,000 eggs, we would only expect about 2 of them to complete the life cycle and make it back as spawning adults. Now, that might seem like an awful waste, but keep in mind that all of the other eggs that didn't make it, or all the other baby fish, or all the big fish that didn't make it, were food for other animals. There are 138 vertebrate animals that depend on salmon at some point in their life as an important food source. This includes many fish, birds, and mammals, including humans and orca whales. This is a view inside of the redd. We have some eggs that maybe didn't get fertilized, and we have some newborn salmon, really weird looking creatures. They have this large jelly bean attached to them. That's the remains of the yolk sac of the egg. It also contains their first meal, so they'll slowly digest the material in that sac. And while they still have it visible, they are considered alevin. This is a more developed alevin. Once that last little bit of yolk has been integrated into the body, it will have to leave the redd, and at that point, it'll be considered a fry. And it will mostly be eating small plankton in the water. Eventually, as it gets big enough to eat small invertebrates, it'll be called a par. These are par marks. All of the species of salmon have the par marks, and it helps them camouflage. They like to hide in the side channels or slow-moving water along the river and keep cool and cold and find little bugs to eat at this stage. Those par that make it to the end of the river then enter the estuary. An estuary is an area where you have fresh water from the river mixing with salt water from the ocean, and it's all surrounded partially by land. First, they enter the river delta estuary. Then from there, they move on to the bay estuary. Then from there, they move into the Salish Sea, which technically counts as an estuary as well. They will spend about 4 months of their lives in this system of estuaries. While these young salmon are in the estuary, they're considered smolts, and their body is going through a process called smoltification. They were in a freshwater environment, and now they're transitioning into a saltwater environment. And in those two environments, their cells have to do totally different things. In a freshwater environment, solutes are very rare. Solutes being things like salts and minerals. So on the cellular level, the cells are holding on to those salts and minerals and other solutes and pushing out excess water because there's lots of fresh water around. In a marine or saltwater environment, there's lots of solutes all around in the environment. There's lots of salts and minerals, but there's not very much fresh water. So the cells are pushing out the extra solutes and holding on to the fresh water within the system. It's very difficult to go from a freshwater environment to a saltwater environment, which is why we very rarely have fish that go back and forth. Usually fish are entirely freshwater or entirely marine. As the smolts get bigger and stronger, they head deeper into the estuary. Now they're starting to look for forage fish, which are their favorite food source. They need to eat a lot in order to be big enough and strong enough to make it in the open ocean, which is not protected by land and has much rougher waters. It's possible they may encounter the southern resident orcas at this time, but they don't really have to worry about them. These fish are maybe yay big, far too small for the orca whales to bother with them. Eventually, they'll make it to the open ocean. Assuming they live the full life cycle, this is where they will spend the majority of their lives. The average Chinook returning to the Salish Sea has spent about 4 years in the marine environment. However, they can spend up to 8 years there, and typically the longer they stay, the larger they are when they return. But for whatever reason, however long they stay, they eventually try to make their way back upriver so they can spawn. This is the time the southern orca whales have been waiting for. This is the summer arrival of the Chinook salmon, and it is their time to feast and eat lots and lots of Chinook. But some inevitably are able to make it to the river, though they do have a long trek ahead of them. Those select few that make it back to the spawning ground are rewarded by passing on their genes to the next generation. The male here spawning this red will then move on to another red and try to pass on as many genes to as many different reds as possible. The female, however, will protect her genes for the next generation by protecting the red for the rest of her life, though the rest of her life is not very long. Depending on circumstances, it might be days or it might be weeks. All adult Pacific salmon that make it upriver eventually die. This is really good for the whole watershed because these salmon are bringing nutrients from the ocean back upriver to an area that is generally considered nutrient poor, and a lot of animals and plants benefit from these nutrients. All right, so what are Chinook populations doing? How have they been changing over time in our area? Here we have some of our major watersheds, and we are comparing 2 different time periods to see, are the Chinook increasing during these time periods in green or decreasing in red? There are a lot of places that are red, but a primary area that's green, which is here, is the Skagit watershed. The Skagit River watershed has been a major focus for restoration work for Chinook salmon. One of the unique things that the Skagit River watershed has going on for it is that a lot of the land, particularly upriver, is protected by various government and nonprofit organizations. This is an image upriver. Here's the river, and these squares or boxes are various parcels of lands that are protected by different organizations. There are many organizations that have claims on parts of these lands, including the Department of Natural Resources, Seattle City Lights, Skagit Land Trust, the Nature Conservancy, U.S. Department of Fish and Wildlife, not to mention the North Cascades National Park. These areas have protections, they have rules set in place so that the land isn't degraded in such a way that it hinders our endangered Chinook. Sometimes in these areas, we're able to do specific restoration projects that are designed to increase the habitat for salmon. But this work is also done on private land with permission of awesome landowners like these folks that allowed the Skagit Fisheries Enhancement Group to replace their culvert. This is the before picture, and this is the culvert. A culvert is just a big pipe through which water flows. They're used when people want to inexpensively build a road over said body of flowing water. However, they can often make it difficult for salmon to get from one side to the other, especially as the culverts age and sometimes kind of collapse or get filled in with sediments and such. This bridge here has a nice big open area that could accommodate a lot of flood water and is a lot better suited for salmon moving from one side to the other. Also, I think it's a lot more attractive. Here are two images of the Skagit River. The one on the right here is upriver and the one on the left is downriver. You'll notice on the image to the right, there are several side channels. Historically, the Skagit River was filled with side channels like this all up and down the river. And the river was allowed to freely migrate from one area to another. However, beginning in the mid-1800s, when people from European descent started moving into the area, they started changing the river to better suit their needs. They straightened the river and they also added dikes. Now, this is great if you're a farmer and you have land right next to the river. However, it's not great if you're a salmon. If this area were to flood, then these sandy areas would just fill in with water, and the little salmon would have shallow areas with slow-moving water that they could ride out the storm, as it were, and stay in the river for a longer period of time, which is what the salmon need. If there was a salmon in this area of the river and it flooded, it would have no place with slow-moving water to hide, so it would just be pushed farther down into the estuary prematurely. Restoration projects along the river include increasing the number of side channels there are and other safe places for the salmon to go that are protected and particularly well shaded so it's nice and cool, and also where we have the ability to removing some dikes, particularly towards the river delta. Now into the sea, a major issue with restoration has to do with armoring. About a quarter of the Puget Sound area has some form of armoring, an example of which is here. So this cement wall is armoring the area between the coastline and this more developed land. So in this project, we removed the armoring and put in a more salmon-friendly erosion control area. And the result was this really nice beach that is much more better suited for salmon, not only for salmon, but also for their most important food source, which are forage fish. Two species of forage fish, which are the sand lances, which we'll see later in this presentation, and surf smelts, will lay their eggs directly on a sandy beach like this in the intertidal zone. So this area that people are walking in might actually have little eggs underneath them. Here's a picture close up of that habitat. So we have little grains of sand here, and then these are surf smelt eggs. More forage fish could lead to more salmon, could lead to more orca whales, but how many salmon do we need to restore the orca whale populations in the southern resident subspecies? Well, the southern residents eat 18 to 25 Chinook every day. For the current population, we need a minimum of 1,400 adult Chinook every day for them to eat. If we were able to restore the populations of the southern resident orcas to their more historical numbers of 140 or more, we would need at least 1 million adult Chinook every year for these animals to eat. And of course, there also needs to be enough salmon to go around to other species that like to eat them, including seals and humans. So that's all I'm going to say about salmon for now. Let's move on to noise. Let's reconsider the critical habitats of the southern resident orcas. This is a region that gets a lot of vessel traffic. For example, in Padilla Bay here, on this side, there are 2 oil refineries. Those oil refineries are always shipping crude oil from Alaska to be processed into products like gasoline. And you will always see boats like this, sometimes several boats like this, in the process of shipping the 1 million+ gallons of crude oil that are transported there every day. Let's head a little farther west into Anacortes. Have you ever gone to Anacortes and hopped a ferry to the San Juan Islands? I know I have. And I was on a ferry that looked like this. There are 22 Washington State ferries, and during the summertime, for most of the day, they are all in operation. Some ferry services run 20 hours a day, constantly moving and constantly making noise for these animals. And of course, there are a lot of many smaller vessels that are operating in the Salish Sea area, including whale watching tours, where people have paid good money and they really want to get as close as they possibly can to the orca whales. This might stress them out a bit. Have you ever been on one of these boats? If so, you may recall that they sound a bit like this. And you might be thinking to yourself, like, yeah, they're loud, but they're not that loud. What's the big deal? Well, there are a few things that we need to remember. Thing number one, we need to remember that sound waves travel differently underwater than they do in the air. They actually travel 4 times faster underwater, which means they sound louder farther away than they would in the air. Second thing you have to remember is that we as human beings are used to perceiving the world around us primarily with our vision, whereas orca whales primarily view the world around them via their ears. They use echolocation to hunt, and they use vocalizations to communicate with one another. To better illustrate the problem, imagine for a moment that you are an orca whale. You're a hungry orca whale, and you are listening for the sound of salmon. This is the sound of a salmon. Since you're an orca whale, I want you to mainly be using your sense of hearing in this experiment. In fact, I invite you to close your eyes if you're comfortable with it. I am going to make 6 different salmon sounds, and I want you to see how many you can hear. Ready? This is the first one. Did you hear all 6? If you did, maybe you'd make a really good orca whale. Even if you did you really have to strain your ears to hear that? Could you imagine having to strain your ears all day to be able to find food, to be able to communicate with those around you? Could you imagine under those circumstances that it may be difficult to sleep, that it may be difficult to actually find food? It might be difficult to hear warnings of danger. It might be difficult to interpret signals that there's an orca nearby that might like to mate with you. Something to think about. So what are people doing about this? Well, one of the main tools we have is creating laws to protect the orcas. These are Washington state laws that all vessels need to follow in order to keep a safe distance and go a safe speed around orca whales. There are also some additional guidelines that are specific to whale watching tours. The third major problem that is faced by the southern resident orcas is toxins within the water. Particularly, we're concerned with what are called persistent organic pollutants. These are chemicals that have particular qualities that allow them to concentrate up the food chain. Perhaps the most important thing to understand about these chemicals is that they're all hydrophobic. This means they will not bond with water, but they will bond with other hydrophobic substances. Substances such as body fat, substances such as dirt and dust. When these pollutants are introduced into a body, such as a killer whale's body, they will quickly attach to the animal's fat, and there they will remain. If there's new sources of the pollutant coming in, they will accumulate over time and the concentration will grow. Even if the concentration is very high, these pollutants will not outright kill an animal. But these chemicals may mimic other compounds, such as hormones that naturally exist in the system and cause problems as a result. PCBs are a major concern among killer whales because they are some of the most contaminated animals in the world for this chemical. PCB contamination in orca whales can result in poor development of the reproductive systems. Females that have contamination issues with PCBs may have a harder time getting pregnant, and they may be more likely to lose their calf. Next, I want to talk about DDT. DDT is an insecticide that was banned in the United States in 1973. I wasn't able to find a lot of information about the impacts of DDT specifically on orca whales, but I know a bit about how they affected bald eagles, and that has impacted my life personally, and so I wanted to share that with you. DDT is part of the reason that the bald eagle almost went extinct. You can see here in the late 1950s, there were only a few hundred mating pairs of bald eagles in the entire United States. DDT is an insecticide, as I said. It's sprayed over the land and it gets into the water system, and in the water system, it gets into the fat tissues of little fish that are eaten by the bald eagles, and then it gets into the bodies of the bald eagles, and then when the bald eagles produce eggs, it results in their eggshells being developed very thin, and they had a tendency of cracking during incubation. Even though there was a growing body of evidence showing that DDT caused problems like this in the ecosystem, the company that produced DDT fought very hard to keep their product in production because it was a very profitable thing for them to do. But ultimately, in 1972, it was outlawed. Shortly after DDT was removed from the market, populations in bald eagles started increasing drastically. Now, this wasn't entirely due to the removal of DDT from the market, but it was a major contributing source. When I was a little girl, I remember being told that bald eagles were an endangered species. And like all endangered species, there was a good chance that by the time I was old enough to have little kids, they would no longer be around. Now, as an adult woman living in the Skagit Valley, I see a bald eagle pretty much every week, sometimes every day, sometimes multiple times a day. And to me, that is such a source of optimism when it comes to endangered species. I know that we as human beings can pull together and make a difference. I know it's possible that future generations of people can look at these animals, look at Chinook salmon, look at orca whales, and say, wow, it's amazing what people can do. It's amazing that we can work with our natural ecology. We can work with these animals to protect them. I also just briefly wanted to show this advertisement by the company that makes DDT for a couple of reasons. One, I find it ironic that the bird in it is disappearing. And two, just as a reminder for you, dear viewers, to think about the products that you use and the things that you buy. Ask questions. How will these affect the watershed? What are the impacts they may have on me and my family and my community? The more questions you ask and the more information you seek out, the more power you have. And now we'll get off my soapbox and head back to my presentation. Next, I want to talk about PBDEs. These are a group of chemicals that are still in use. In fact, in your room you're currently sitting, there are probably multiple products that have them, including your carpet. You probably don't usually think of a carpet as a product, but it's something you can buy, so it is a product. These chemicals are included in products as flame retardants to make it so they don't combust easily, which is important. But you may be wondering to yourself, all right, so there's a chemical in my couch that I'm sitting on. How the heck is it going to end up in the body of an orca whale? Let's talk about that. I have a story to tell you. There are many ways that this process could happen, but this is one example that I think is easy to comprehend. Our story begins with a free couch on a driveway. This is an old couch, and since it's an old couch, it's got lots of dust in its cushions. The dust particles in the cushions pick up small hitchhikers. These hitchhikers are PBDE molecules that bond to them tightly. Every time somebody sits on this couch, those little dust particles are spewed out and end up on the driveway. Eventually the couch is picked up, someone's very happy to have it and haul it away, but those contaminated dust particles hang out on the driveway and they stay there until the next hard rain. When the rain comes, it is washed down into the storm drain. In fact, lots of chemicals are washed down the storm drain, even when the water looks really, really clean. These are some of the things that are often introduced into the watershed via storm drains, and most of them are not very beneficial for the animals that live there. Typically, storm drains flow directly to the closest running body of water. These running body of waters ultimately make their way to the Puget Sounds. The dust particles floating in the water may be mistaken for food by zooplankton. As the zooplankton eat the dust particles, the PBDEs that are attached to them end up in the body fat of these small animals. These zooplankton may then be eaten by our sand lance. Contaminated forage fish, like the sand lance, will then be eaten by animals like the salmon. Those salmon then will be eaten by animals like the orca whale. Persistent organic pollutants, such as PCBs, go through a process known as biomagnification. In this process, you start at the bottom of the food chain with a small concentration of pollution. And as you head up the food chain, the concentration of pollution magnifies within the bodies. Orca whales are particularly susceptible because not only are they top predators, but they also have a very high percentage of body fat, and they live very long periods of time. If you're at all concerned about the salmon, generally scientists say the quantities of chemicals like PCBs in the salmon don't cause them any problems directly, Also, don't face any problems for humans that eat salmon, because if we eat salmon, we eat them only occasionally. However, orca whales, who can eat 25 adult salmon every day for 80 years, can accumulate a lot of toxins. They can accumulate so many toxins, particularly PCBs, in their system that when they're dead, their bodies are considered hazardous waste and have to be removed. So what are people doing to help this really big problem? Well, one thing we're doing is we are working on understanding the toxicity of different areas throughout the Salish Sea. The pollutants that are washed downriver that don't get eaten will settle down into the soils. So a lot of our sediments downriver, particularly by really urban areas, have a lot of PCBs, a lot of DTTs, and other chemicals that haven't yet entered to the food web. So we need to know which of these soils are most contaminated and decide what are the best ways to handle these areas. We're also doing research to make sure what is the best way to dispose of products that have PCBs. Historically, PCB containing products were disposed of in a way that may have led to them being introduced into the Salish Sea. And now people are working very hard to make sure that they're handled in other ways so that they don't get into the Salish Sea. Now, within the watershed of the Salish Sea and beyond, equipment still does exist that contains PCBs. The government is now having decisions as to what should be done with these pieces of equipment. Should it become illegal to own such equipment? Or should the government offer certain incentives for people to update that equipment with something newer that doesn't have PCBs in it, and of course, dispose of the old stuff appropriately? We'll see what comes from those conversations as time continues. Another way of combating this is to minimize the amount of stormwater that ends up going down storm drains. One of the ways that the government has been doing that is by making low impact development laws. These are laws that have to do with the way new construction sites are put in, so that some of the water doesn't flow directly into the sewage system, but goes into a holding area, such as a bioswale, where the water can soak in the ground and filter out the pollutants before it's entered back into the waterways. Homeowners of properties that were built prior to these low impact development laws are being encouraged to reduce their stormwater runoff in other ways, such as putting in rain gardens, which have the same effect of holding water and letting the water filter through, or putting in impervious surfaces, such as a driveway where instead of the water rushing right off, it is allowed to trickle through. That is the end of my presentation. I hope you learned a lot. I know I learned a lot in putting this presentation together. These are some of the main resources I used for the information that I did not currently have. And thank you very much. I hope the rest of your day goes just great. Bye.